And welcome to Bad Morning News. Bad morning, everyone. We have a Discord server now. So, I guess that's the first item of housekeeping. If you want to keep up on all the bullshit that we're doing, we can be reached at the Discord, and you can also post anything you want in relation to the show there, including stories that you want us to cover on the Friday community-driven episode, which tomorrow is that. So if you decide that you want to contribute something for tomorrow's community-driven episode, we will discuss that article tomorrow. I'm going to have an entire section for it, but for now, just post it in general. But with that being said, this is brought to you by Brave, the ad-resistant, tracker-resistant browsing experience. You can download that, and it'll support this operation. Additionally, the Cash App, which is a $1 and Bitcoin wallet with a Visa card attached to it, and Liberty Mugs, which are mugs that you can use to piss off your coworkers while also consuming fluids. Now, today's going to be a little bit topic-driven because a subject came up in somebody's request to cover this article, and so it's sparked a bunch of other articles that we could also cover that are on similar issues. So I'm going to read a little bit of this article, not the whole thing, but a small amount, and y'all can read the rest if you'd like. But this is from Germany, and it's The Guardian, written by Kate Connolly in Berlin. German couple who sold son to pedophiles on Darknet jailed. Pair from Staufen sentenced to 12 years for rape, sexual abuse, and forced prostitution. A German woman has been sentenced to 12.5 years in prison for selling her son on the Darknet to abusers in a case that has horrified the country and raised questions about its child protection services. The 48-year-old woman and her partner, 39, a convicted pedophile, were convicted of forced prostitution, rape, sexual and physical abuse, humiliation, and bondage in almost 60 separate identified acts. The partner was given a 12-year prison sentence plus a preventative detention order, which will effectively keep him in prison for life. 6 other men, including a Spanish man, a Swiss citizen, and 3 German men who had paid the couple to abuse the boy, now 10, were given sentences of between 8 and 10 years. The court in the southwestern city of Freiburg held that the abuse had been going on for 2 years. The mother had threatened her son with foster care if he reported it. The pedophile ring was operated like a business from the town of Staufen near Freiburg, where the couple lived. Abusers were believed to have paid up to 10,000 euros, or 8,950 pounds at the time, to abuse the boy. The couple, identified only as Baron T and Christian L, admitted to the court that they had sold the boy to numerous men and that they had abused him themselves. They received slightly reduced sentences for passing information to investigators, enabling them to pursue other perpetrators. Others on trial included a 44-year-old German who was given access to rape the boy, but was prevented by the mother from carrying out his wish to kill him. The court heard that the videos made of the abuse were sold for large sums via the Darknet, an area of the internet that can be visited only by using special software. Police exposed the ring last September after an anonymous tip-off. The judge, Stefan Bergelin, said the boy's mother had initially been motivated to take part in the abuse in order to ensure that Christian did not go through with his threats to leave her. Subsequently, it was financial incentives, Bergelin said. The shocking details of the case, the worst of its kind in German criminal history, have triggered calls for an overhaul of Germany's child welfare facilities. Questions have been asked as to why no welfare officer picked up on the boy's plight and why no attempt was made to prevent him from living under the same roof as a convicted pedophile. Wilhelm Rohrig, a government-appointed envoy for abused minors, said a string of bureaucratic failures that enabled abuse of the boy to continue for so long were inexcusable and would have to be unsparingly examined. He said the case highlighted flaws in the family court system, and he suggested family judges should in the future receive more legal training in the sexual abuse of minors. He also called for more funding for youth services. So I guess that's the whole article, but whatever, you know, fuck it. This was written on the 7th, well, published anyway, on the 7th of August this year. So it's a fairly recent case, and it pretty much highlights the fact that, what about the children? Well, clearly government didn't help very much here.
Well, this is the when it comes to the UK, at least, I can speak to that. Germany, it's a bit more difficult. That Europe has had some interesting events when it comes to child abuse or trafficking. There's always that ever-famous Fritzl case, for example. I'm not saying these things are the norm, but they do happen. And it's important to remember that. But I think a lot of people don't understand just how frequently it is actually going on.
Well, and beyond that, I think that, it is normal at this point. I mean, to say that it's not normal means that it doesn't happen regularly, and I would say that, like, there's almost no accountability in this case.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, accountability is a major issue here because nobody's willing to take it. And those that are willing to take it aren't willing, the people that they're going to take it against aren't willing for them to have that power. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, and because the primary problem here is the fact that, like, this kind of thing goes on in the background while people who have been convicted of having problems controlling themselves around children have children, and then what do you know, they have problems controlling themselves around those children. I mean, they abuse the kid themselves. Is like, that's fucking obviously a problem.
oh yeah, obvious. I'm not saying it isn't either.
No, no. I wasn't saying you were. I was saying that it's like really common compared to what people want to believe. The world is much seedier than people want to think it is.
Oh, of course it is. And it's about time people start waking up to that. But that's why we do this show, isn't it, mate?
Yeah, yeah. Gotta get people literally waking up to this sort of shit. But you had a similar article on this subject.
I've got a few now, mate.
Yeah.
To be quite frank, I tend to have about 15 or 20 of these sorts of investigations on my radar at any one time, mainly because I follow the ITNJ, which is the International Tribunal for Natural Justice, which is a massive international treaty specifically signed to fight child sex trafficking and trafficking in general. But here's one's actually from 15 hours ago from The Independent. Modern slavery prosecutions rise by a quarter amid criticism of government crackdown. More than 5,000 potential modern slaves were referred for help last year, but the CPS only prosecuted 239 suspects. The number of modern slavery prosecutions has risen by more than a quarter in the past year, but still make up a small fraction of the thousands of potential cases flagged to authorities. The Crown Prosecution Service, known as CPS in Britain, said it was committed to improving its response to forced labor and sexual and criminal exploitation after MPs warned that a national strategy had yet to result in coherent action. Alison Saunders, the outgoing Director of Public Prosecution, said modern slavery has a devastating, lasting impact on its victims. There's no place in our society for those who enslave others, whether for work, sexual or criminal exploitation, or domestic servitude. Oh my God. And related news stories. UK voodoo nurse trafficked Nigerian women to work as prostitutes. And government thwarted in bid to deport modern slavery victim. So they try to, it seems like they're doing everything they can to NIMBY this problem. We are working in partnership with police and other partners from the outset to make sure we can build robust cases and deliver justice for victims. Figures show that in the 2017-18 financial year, 239 suspects were charged with modern slavery offenses, 185 people were convicted. They include a gang who trafficked Vietnamese women to work in nail bars, and a Slovakian family who forced desperate and destitute people with mental health problems and learning disabilities to carry out work while living in dire conditions. Members of a county lines drug gang were prosecuted for modern slavery for the first time after imprisoning a teenager and forcing her to become a drug mule. British citizens became the largest group of potential modern slave flagged to the National Referral Mechanism for the first time last year, and the CPS warned that violent gangs are exploiting vulnerable people, often children, to move and sell drugs across the country. A total of 5,145 potential victims were referred to the system last year, an increase of 35% on the year before, and the National Crime Agency believes the number will continue to rise. Referrals to the CPS from police and other agencies rose by a third to 355, the highest figure ever recorded. And prosecutors said the increase was part of a, quote, dedicated drive to clamp down on slavery-related crime. But the annual report warned that the time taken for investigations has lengthened to an average of 3 years, double the duration in 2015.
Slavery-related crime.
Yeah,
Slavery-related crime.
In order to take it to trial, 3 years. 3 years to take that to trial. That's how long it's taking now. Because of the complexities caused by having multiple defendants and victims who often need translation services and other support. The CPS only decides to charge suspects in 67% of cases referred to it, down from 83%, and 65% of those prosecuted are convicted. Ms. Saunders said CPS has made significant progress in its response to modern slavery, but remains, quote, aware that there is much more to do. These cases are growing in size and complexity. That's why we have given our prosecutors extensive extra training. Reducing the burden on victims and witnesses has been a key part of this training. The CPS also deploys staff in the government's Organized Immigration Crime Task Force to disrupt traffickers and has a network of 30 specialist prosecutors based overseas to target smugglers in transit countries. Earlier this year, the CPS hosted prosecutors from 15 countries from Europe, Africa, and South America to increase coordination and, quote, prepare for changes that may need to be made to the way in which we operate after Brexit. But in May, MPs concluded that modern slavery is not understood by the government, and it has no idea whether or not its crackdown is working. The Public Accounts Committee concluded that good intentions have yet to result in coherent action against the crimes, with no measure of success for a nationwide strategy and inconsistency between regional police forces. A report on work to reduce modern slavery found that the government had not calculated the number of modern slaves in Britain, after making an estimate of 10,000 to 13,000 in 2013, or how much money it has spent combating the issue. So we don't have a budget, we don't have a target. I mean, if you were looking at this from a business perspective, it's like, yeah, we don't have a business plan, but we're gonna take this money, we're gonna do something with it. There you go. Will you invest?
Well, we have the very best plan. You know, the plan that you don't even need to know about to have the understanding that it's the best possible thing that you could do. We're the best crew.
Yeah, as Krieger might say, don't worry about it. HM Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate called for a more formal structure on modern slavery nationwide in December, calling for the CPS to improve training, introduce quality assurances, and explain the gulf between modern slavery referrals and prosecutions. CPS says it was implementing recommendations and it had appointed a chief crown prosecutor to coordinate its work. While awareness of modern slavery has been increasing, some operations have been met with controversy. Eastern European flower farm workers protested after their employer was arrested on suspicion of modern slavery offenses in February, and Devon and Cornwall police dropped the case after discussions with the CPS. The force said 14 people chose to leave the farm with partnership support, and 160 workers were safeguarded in total, adding, it's important to recognize the police had to ensure that the response to serious allegations of modern slavery were followed up and responded to the gravity this underreported crime deserves. Victoria Atkins, the Minister for Crime, Safeguarding and Vulnerability. Jesus, how many ministers do we have? So the new CPS figures were a, quote, clear and stark warning to perpetrators of modern slavery and human trafficking. There is no hiding place for those who seek to exploit or harm others. These figures reflect years of work by government prosecutors and law enforcement. However, we want to go further as this crime evolves and have recently announced an independent review of our laws to explore what more we can do to tackle this awful crime both in the UK and abroad. So, lip service at the moment that things are changing and more things are at least getting highlighted, but it doesn't look like much is actually being. It seems like a lot of effort, sort of. This is kind of a swan swim. It's a lot of effort producing not a lot of results. But that's the government for you, really, isn't it, in the end?
Yeah, and I'm addressing this in text chat as well, but Danielle's here, and she's here asking whether or not this is more normal. And I would say that it's much less normal than it used to be, given the fact that there are countless religions and social structures built around essentially this sort of grooming, and this sort of child slavery, and usually in the disguise of like arranged marriages and other shit like that, or pederasty or whatever. Like, there have been cultures historically based almost entirely around the rearing of children in a similar way. And so I would say it is getting better in that way, because at least we're rejecting that, in the Western world, which is the primary population of the world. But, the real solution here is that we have to get rid of these, like, ancient cultures that are based on essentially ethical flaws, or at least reform them. Which is a place Bill Maher and I would agree in a very strong way, where you don't have cultures that are still practicing arranged marriages for like children, like little girls, fucking being arranged in wedlock before they could even consent. And the fact that this still exists is not isolate. It's not like Western civilization exists in a vacuum. These sorts of people have existed all throughout history, and they're actually actively less. So I guess that would be my response to her.
I'd say that it has been the norm, and we didn't know it was the norm, because it was very carefully... Sorry, my mic has moved.
No, I mean, I heard what you said, but like, it was written in the holy texts. So like,
no,
what?
No, I'm not talking about specific religious groups that have taken a literal view, very literal view on what those texts mean, and the information. I mean,
I'm just saying, it used to be more normal.
I'm not saying any different to that either. It's become less and less normal over time. I mean, think about it. Back in the Middle Ages, it was quite normal for anybody who had just gone into puberty to then be basically married off to extend the power of the family itself. That was very common in the aristocracy. It was actually quite common in some of the smaller, like, merchant groups. And if you were a peasant, well, there was always prima nocta. So there was always some sort of little thing that they could do to basically say, yeah, we have the right to your child from this perspective. And
or just like our God doesn't like frown on this, or our God says go with it because it's better than being a slave. I mean, this is all like, essentially, what's the fucking term for it? It's like one's better than the other. Relativist fallacy. It's like saying, well, would you rather do this? Well, I would rather do neither, and you're not giving me that option. And it's sort of like that sort of thing when it comes to this sort of like application of religion.
No, I know, I'd agree with that. But from my perspective, religion is tangential to it. It has a tendency to promote it within specific
Oh, yeah.
religions, but it is a tangential issue. It's not. It's not that everybody who's involved in a given religion, be it Catholicism, Islam, Hindu, it doesn't matter. It's not tied to religion. It's tied to power.
Right.
And
And
it
the
just
fact that
coincides. Religious people have a lot of power if they're in control of the religion.
and of course, like that sort of power comes from a place of perceived authority. So the moment you get rid of that perceived authority, the normalcy leaves.
So, I mean, there's a fairly famous there's a fairly famous UK politician, Cyril Smith, who died. And again, similar to Jimmy Savile, he died and then got found out to be a sexual abuser of, anybody it seems like he could get his hands on. But, and I'm pulling this up from, to be fair, this is almost a year ago now. MI5 new prosecutors lied to press about Cyril Smith case. Inquiry told. UK child abuse inquiry. His security services took no action after the DPP made false claims over decisions not to press charges. MI5 told prosecutors lied to journalists about their decision not to press charges against the late Cyril Smith, but took no action as its role was to, quote, defend the realm an inquiry is heard. So let's just take that one phrase right now and just quickly look at that, because what they're basically saying is it's more important to preserve the appearance of Britain than it is to actually protect the people of Britain, is in effect what that means, because he was a very prominent individual in politics over here. And for his name to be defamed would defame the government at that time and everything that it did and everything that he did.
Dude.
Brings the realm out of, which basically puts the realm under threat. Therefore, they can't charge him.
Right. It's like that line from Rich Man's World by Immortal Technique, and you don't want my lawyers. What was it? You don't want me indicted because you don't want my dirty laundry aired your dirty laundry aired when I fight it. Fucking, and fucking, what was the next line? Yeah, don't get my lawyers excited because what good is a law if you can't rewrite it? Fucking great stuff right there. Because like that's pretty much a lot of what this corruption is. Like it breeds more corruption because nobody wants to talk about it while they're also going to be talked about.
And to that end, let's look at France now quickly, because I pulled this up a few days ago and got into a rather heated debate over it with somebody. But I thought I'd quickly discuss it with everybody here. This is from Afadoli, which is a French website, and I am currently using Google Translate, so I apologize to anybody who speaks French that if my translations are shit, it's Google's fault. Chiapa law, abandonment of minimum age of sexual consent, angry associations. Now, quick caveat before anybody asks this question: France has never had a minimum age of consent. I had to like check this because somebody told me that, and I was like, no, come on, that's not true. And no, they've never had an age of consent. So conceptually, to some of us, that may make no sense whatsoever, but that is where they are starting from. So child protection associations became indignant after the adoption of the law against sexual and gender-based violence. According to them, the government has betrayed its, quote, promise by giving up a minimum age of sexual consent. On the 3rd of August, the draft law against sexual and gender-based violence, known as the Chiapa law, was finally adopted by the parliament. But the Child Protection Association denounces a retreat of the government on a promise, set an age of minimum for sexual consent. In a statement, the association's Coup d'Éponge, Action Against Child Prostitution, and the French Council of Associations for the Rights of the Child have rebelled. This should be the flagship measure of the bill, the introduction of an age below which children would automatically be considered unable to consent to sex with adults. The wish of these associations was the following: to see written in the law that any penetration of a young minor would constitute de facto a rape. This abandonment of the legal age of consent may be surprising, since the debate initially focused on the appropriate threshold, 13 or 15 years. Finally, the choice was made to abandon the principle of minimum age. In its final version, the Schiappa law provides that for children under the age of 15, the moral constraint or the surprise is characterized by the abuse of the vulnerability of the victim, who does not have the necessary discernment for these acts. For the former Minister of Women's Rights and Socialist Senator Lawrence Rossignol, these notions of vulnerability and discernment leave too much room for the freedom of for a free judgment of judges. Jacques Coulon of the Union Syndicale des Magistrates, for his part, argued a communication problem of the government, and told AFP the criminal law is based on the presumption of innocence, a principle that dates from the Declaration of Human Rights. If this presumption of guilt had been retained in the law, it would have been found unconstitutional by the Constitutional Council. The magistrate also states that the penalty for raping a minor under the age of 15 is 20 years imprisonment. So, and here's where it gets odd. So that's the end of the article, by the way, everybody. And it has a lot of associated sources from RT France, gouvernement.fr, Wikipedia, cdpenfrance.fr, and liberation.fr. So there's a number of subsources. But the interesting part of this is the council's determination that the concept of an age of consent, a minimum age that somebody can say, I can consent to this, would inherently create a condition of guilt. Now, I don't understand this. I don't understand why anybody could comprehend of that being the norm, why it would create automated guilt. It's not that the process has changed. You still have to prove the crime occurred. You still have to prove that sex occurred and that the person knew what they were doing. And therefore, if that's the case, then it's illegal. I mean, this is how it's worked. And I'm not advocating that the state should be the arbiter of this before anybody goes, oh, look, an anarchist advocating for the state to do something. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's what we have now. What I would like to have is far more complicated, but what we have now is what we have to work with. So let's talk about what we have now and work with it. And this is where I'm struggling to understand it. Almost every single country in the world that has a functioning legal system has innocent until proven guilty as a core pillar of that legal system. And a lot of those countries have a minimum age of consent. So to say that that minimum age of consent violates the concept of innocent until proven guilty just doesn't make sense to me. I don't get that one.
Well, I mean, it's designed, like, to me, this is apparent, so I'm just going to say it's apparently designed to protect people who want the old ways to remain intact.
I'd agree. And the reason why I agree is I actually did some research into why this law was even put forward in the first place. So when I first read this article, it changed. It looks like it's changed a little bit over the past few days. There were two high-profile French cases in which an 11-year-old was basically raped by an older man. And in both cases, it was, again, judge's discretion, and both of them claimed there was consent. And both of them got off because lack of consent could not be proved. And this is where it becomes problematic. If you cannot prove that a child does not understand what was going on and what it meant and didn't agree to it in France, they can get away with basically abusing your child and say that she was up for it. And it's the same sort of arguments people used to use for like against like on rape charges and whatnot that they actually did is oh, she was up for it. No, you put GHB in her drink. There's like it's things like that that had to be tackled for years in the States. So to hear in France that they've gone down exactly the same argument route, it just baffles me.
Well, I mean, not all cultures are going to advance at the same time. To
be fair, true, but France has been a fairly well. No, actually, what am I saying? They're the source of postmodernism. So yeah, maybe I should just basically count my correctness now and just leave it there.
Well, I mean, on that level, fucking Charlie Hebdo was an exception to the norm. So, yeah. I mean, the norm in France is sort of like fake liberalism. Like, it's one of the origin points for liberalisme being turned from freedom and liberation into essentially an excuse to blame anything on somebody so that you can be a victim. Like, you can look at this, their universities were some of the first places where these sorts of mentalities came out. And, you know, it's a real shame because anarchy came from French, too. So, fucking...
Well, strictly speaking,
well, it
comes from anarchos, but that's... Greek. It comes from the Greek root, but it was extended in French. It gained more prominence again because of the French.
Well, I mean, anarchos wasn't a Greek thing, though. It comes from Greek roots through the French language. Like, anarchism started in France and, you know, started to be called terrorism because certain anarchists would throw bombs into public squares in order to try and enact their change. And that's why terrorism has always been considered violence for political change, and why it's always been funny that governments aren't called terrorists by most people. But, you know, this is an aside. But, I mean, it's a center of cultural liberation and always has been. That's the reason why people can get off to Les Miserables. So, I'm not being too harsh there, am I? Fucking...
I mean, don't get me wrong. I find it odd that somebody would do a musical about the French Revolution, one of the most bloodiest things ever. But hey, let's glorify that complete mess of a liberty movement that then turned into instantaneously a new dictatorship.
See, but you're being too nice, because, I mean, if you call it a liberty movement... If you call it a liberty movement, you have to say that the people involved were there for liberty and not just for a change to the system.
Oh, yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, everybody was just basically in it to basically... We don't want to change the system. We just want to change who's in charge of it. That's all. I'm sure everybody can understand that, yeah? And everybody would agree, well, I mean, obviously.
And a similar thing happened in America, which is why the Whiskey Rebellion was crushed.
Oh,
why they didn't just say, hey, you know, actually, we sympathize with that. Let's let them do it. Instead, they crushed the Whiskey Rebellion because we can't have a tax rebellion. We just had one of those. Fucking...
I know. But to continue the issue list, basically, I mean, it's not just... The problem is that you'll start seeing, if you look into this properly, you start seeing trends. And they're always like, yes, we're going to do this. We're going to make everything better. We're going to put all this effort in. And then something like this happens. People trafficking case collapses over disclosure failings. A judge has ordered the Crown, and this is from the BBC from January, unfortunately. A judge has ordered the Crown Prosecution Service to explain itself in a case that collapsed because social media evidence was not disclosed. A trial of 3 people held on trafficking and prostitution charges was stopped after the material cast out on the complainant's story. Judge Perrin said a failure to disclose material earlier would appear to be the result of incompetence. The CPS said it was concerned by the outcome and would review its case. The trial of Adrian Jordan and Soria Laut, oh God, I'm not even going to try that surname, and Petruta Cristina Boscana Bosoakana even, was stopped after the complainant in the case had been cross-examined. The defendants were charged with people trafficking under the Modern Slavery Act and controlling prostitution charges under the Sexual Offences Act. Hundreds of court cases are axed over failings. They're accused of conspiracy to traffic a young woman to the UK from Romania for the purposes of prostitution. One defendant, Miss Bosoanoka, gave birth to her during her 13 months in custody. And Clive Coleman, BBC's legal correspondent, did some analysis. This case could not illustrate more dramatically the devastating effect on people's lives that can result from a failure on the part of police and prosecutors to disclose evidence to the defense, which can assist the defense. Christina Boscanen spent more than 13 months in prison, during which time she's given birth, and she should never have been there in the first place. Her case also proves evidence that disclosure failures are not limited to rape, and that there is, as lawyers in the criminal justice systems have been telling me for years, a systemic problem with disclosure. So we've got a real problem with people actually following processes. I've been spending most of this time, when I've not been talking, trying to find the name of a UK cop who did a deposition about an hour and a half long for INTJ regarding his efforts to fight child molestation and child abuse and child trafficking. And he would tell basically his story. He kept getting moved to different departments and whatnot, partly under his own will, but partly because he'd get to a certain stage in his investigation and then be told to drop it.
Right.
And he said, well, you're going to have to move me then, because otherwise I won't be able to work here. And so and he'd go again.
Well, then while you read that, while you look for that information, I'll read a story similar in tone to those, but sort of the opposite. Cop and state attorney, this is on freethoughtproject.com. Cop and state attorney jailed after fellow cops caught them raping a baby and filming it. A Via police officer and state attorney were sentenced to prison this month for horrifying sexual abuse of a baby and several children. In one of the most disgusting cases to ever come across the radar of the Free Thought Project, a police officer has been sentenced to 16 years in prison after he was caught by his fellow officers raping a baby. The now former cop, 48-year-old Dean Roberts, filmed himself abusing a helpless infant while on duty. He then distributed the footage to other pedophiles in a messaging app. His fellow officers caught a different pedophile, also a government employee, who had received the horrifying footage, and then traced it back to one of their own. The former police officer from the South Wales Police Department was then arrested, and it was discovered that he had been plotting with other pedophiles to jointly abuse other children and make them distribute more footage. After his arrest, this vile police officer admitted to rape, sexual assault of a child, possessing and distributing indecent images of children. I can never forget the knock on my door, and my whole world was just falling apart, the mother of the victim said in court. It was just like being hit by a bus. We'll always live with the consequences. What's more, Robert's partner in crime was John Guess, who happened to be also a state employee. According to reports, Guess was a state attorney who worked for the Welsh government as a legal advisor. Guess was sentenced to 26 years in prison earlier this month after he was caught abusing 2 other young girls. According to the court, Guess was also caught taking photos of children as they got changed at swimming pools. Following the sentencing of Roberts and Guess, Detective Superintendent Wendy Gunny said today's sentences reflect the gravity of the crimes that have been committed. The 2 people responsible for the appalling abuse of a number of very young children have not been brought to justice. The investigation uncovered extremely disturbing child abuse evidence, and the guilty pleas have ensured that the jury were spared from viewing evidence that would have been extremely traumatic. Today's sentence does not mark the end of our investigations, and we will work tirelessly to identify any other victims or witnesses and seek the justice they deserve. Not 1 but 2 state actors have been sentenced to prison for horrifying and unspeakable acts against children, including a baby. What's more, one of these monsters' jobs was to protect the community from people like himself. Instead of protecting them, however, he betrayed them and preyed upon them. Disgusting indeed. And then it goes into like a few other cases, and the fact that this is somewhat endemic to a lot of the problem with policing and the fact that people join to essentially take advantage of a system that will allow them to victimize people in the guise of justice.
That's only the half of it, at least for the UK, because, and I finally found the guy's name. His name is, for anybody who's interested, this man's name is John Wedger. He's a former Metropolitan Police officer. He did several child abuse investigations, and at every single turn, basically, when it got to a certain point, he'd get thwarted. And he did I'll explain one of the things that he talked about doing before I go into this article, which is his about his lawsuit against the Metropolitan Police. But one of the things that he did, he got transferred to a new branch for investigations into basically vice crimes and things like that, prostitution and whatnot. He asked one of the people within the team, has anybody called like the local hostels or any of the local children's refuge centers to see if anything has happened to any of the children there? It's like, oh, no, it's all fine, man. It's we checked that. They always tell us there's nothing wrong. So he spends 5 minutes talking to the guys. Like, look, this isn't going to be on you. Tell me, how frequently do you lose track of these people? So, oh yeah, everybody, we lose track of everybody here for at least some period of time. It's at least weekly. And he basically dug, within 15 minutes, he wound up finding at least, I think it was something like 60 cases of potential abuse that needed investigation just at this one facility. And it's that kind of thing where people are turning a blind eye to it because they don't want it to exist. Nobody wants this crime. Nobody wants to even believe this crime is real. But it is. And we have to accept that. We have to accept these things happen and they need to be stopped. And it really does frustrate me when people say, oh, but it's just accusations. It really isn't. There's a lot of evidence if you actually look. And here we go.
And that, by the way, anybody who says the just accusations is failing to accept the possibility that many of those accusations are accurate. Yeah. And to me, like, I mean, if you want to talk accusations, there's a huge movement that's based on essentially the court of public opinion convicting people before any actual like physical allegations can be brought, and that movement is called Me Too.
Yeah.
If you want to oppose simple allegations and rote accusations being used as supplementary evidence, or in some cases the entire rote dismissal of any need for evidence, the supplanting of evidence, then Me Too was a great example of that, where all you have to do is have somebody use the hashtag and suddenly they're believed by countless individuals.
Yeah, and just because, I mean, to me, if you're in support of Me Too and you're not in support of basically crushing the concept of pedogate, then you're just being a hypocrite and basically pandering to the group du jour that you think is more beneficial to you. And I'm sorry if you get offended by that opinion, but that is how I have to look at you, because you aren't consistent about things. I'm not speaking to you personally, obviously, mate. I'm talking to whomever thinks that one is true and the other isn't.
Yeah, royal you.
Yeah. Now, here's what happened to, here's what's happening with John Wedger, at least as of November 12th, 2017. Baby P detective sues, quote, bully police after exposing child abuse and corruption. A former detective commended for his work on the Baby P investigation, which was a whole different kettle of fish, a murder of basically a child who was completely neglected in the process by the equivalent of Child Protective Services. And his death launched a massive inquiry, which I can't remember what the results were. I'd have to look into it. But anyway, he was basically bullied for exposing child abuse and corruption. John Wedger says he was forced into early retirement from the Metropolitan Police after suffering a breakdown last year brought on by post-traumatic stress disorder. The former detective constable has begun a civil claim against Scotland Yard, seeking damages for psychiatric injury arising from work-related stress. Mr. Wedger said that he was bullied after filming an intelligence report alleging that some of his colleagues knew a prostitute was pimping out girls as young as 9, but turned a blind eye. He claimed he was told by a high-ranking Met officer to keep quiet or be, quote, thrown to the wolves. Last night, Father of 4, Mr. Wedger said, I joined the police to serve the community and make a difference. I have wholeheartedly, loyally, and relentlessly pursued, arrested, and prosecuted those I was tasked to target. Yet for doing so and digging up information the police did not want to deal with, my life was made hell. Mr. Wedger, 47, was involved in an investigation into a well-known prostitute in 2004 who was suspected of using children. She was linked to organized crime, but intelligence from multiple sources says she also had connections within the local police. The prostitute would ply youngsters, including a 14-year-old girl, with drugs and alcohol, and then pimp them out to men in budget hotels near Paddington Railway Station in West London. During the course of the operation, Mr. Wedger said he found that not only were the police aware the youngsters were being used for sex, but he believed at least one officer was supplying the criminal gang with information about the investigation. After filing an intelligence report, he was brought in to see a senior officer at Scotland Yard headquarters. Mr. Wedger said, he told me in a firm and formal manner that I had, quote, dug too deep. He then stated if I mentioned a word of my findings outside of this office, he would make sure I was thrown to the wolves. He said, I had a job, mortgage, and children to think about. He then asked me if I felt bullied at work. I replied that I was indeed bullied. He said there was a fairness at work form which I needed to complete. He said that once the form was completed, it would be sent back to him. Pointing to a wastepaper bin, he told me, that's where it will end up. I never betray fellow rank, nor will anyone else. Keep your mouth shut. On his last day with the unit, he was called in by the same officer. He said he offered me his hand. I reciprocated. He said, you must give me your word you will never look into child prostitution ever again. The experience left me traumatized and paranoid. Mr. Wedger joined the Child Abuse Investigation Command in the borough of Haringey, where he became involved with the investigation in 2007 into baby Peter Connolly's death. He was later praised and rewarded for the way he had handled and interviewed with Peter's mother, Tracy. In 2014, following the Jimmy Savile and Rotherham pedophile scandals, Mr. Wedger repeated his claims of a cover-up and the bullying he suffered to a detective inspector, who he says ignored them. He then approached the Met's Department of Professional Standards and was interviewed over 2 days. Later that year, Mr. Wedger was just diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Due to his protracted time off sick, he was placed on half pay, which plunged him into debt. Despite being placed under the care of an NHS mental health team and given counseling, he twice returned to work in 2015, first on the fraud investigation team and then on the Rhodes Death Unit. However, the return to work made his PTSD even worse. Mr. Wedger of Hemel Hempstead, Hertfordshire, was finally given early ill health retirement last month after 23 years of service. He added, I'm relieved to be out. I felt at the center of a huge conspiracy and very much alone. He's now being supported by his local MP, Sir Mike Penning, who's written to the Met chief, Cressida Dick, at the time, for responses to the allegations. So Mike said there are some really serious answers to deal with, both on what John says happened and the way he was treated afterwards. A Met spokesman said, we've received a civil claim from John Wedger. We are considering the claim and will respond in due course as required by the court procedures. And that's the end of the article from The Express. So, yeah, there are people who are trying to uncover this. There are people who are trying to uncover the global network of pedophilia that is actually going on. It's not just Britain. It's not just US. It's not just France or Europe. It's
or Wales.
Everywhere.
Like the baby rapists were in Wales.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this is the thing. There've been Wales is part of Britain, by the way. That's why I didn't mention it.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, fucking.
It's only Ireland that isn't. But yeah, it's the it's not just one or the other. It's bloody everywhere, and we can all keep burying our heads in the sand and pretending it's not there and going, la, 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 I can't hear you. But it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean it isn't true.
Yeah, well, and it also doesn't mean that, you know, even if it was complete bullshit, there isn't something more to it, and there isn't something valuable about having an investigation to begin with.
Exactly. And that is the thing that annoys the hell out of me is in the States, when it came to things like Pizzagate and Pedogate and all these things tied to child abuse and child trafficking, everybody was like, no, fake news, kill this story now. Not, this might actually deserve some sort of investigation, even if it is a very simple one that can just dismiss this out of hand as the nonsense that it is, or would be. But that actually implies that they think it's nonsense.
Well, and let me be real fucking specific here to anybody who's happening to still be listening, even though fucking YouTube keeps on saying there are less people than there obviously are. These people, at the very least, the elites in charge of things, really, you know, not Donald Trump, but the elites really in charge of things, those people, at the very fucking least, artificially sacrifice children to an apple god. At the very least, artificially do that. They, at the very least, artificially eat children in the form of, quote, art exhibits, in spirit cooking. They fucking, at the very least, artificially have the guise of people who are antagonistic to the youth. And so at the very least, you should look at that and look at the mentality of the people in charge of the system that somehow always happens to normalize pedophilia.
And that is the real concern for me, because I personally consider that it is already normalized in a lot of places, or at least if you have enough money, it's automatically normalized because you have enough money and enough power to make that go away. And in any society that is supposed to be built on the concept that all men are equal, etc., that doesn't fly. You can't be allowed to get away with that kind of abuse. It's not kosher. It's just not on.
Well, and you know, to be completely separate, this is the sort of thing that my followers constantly say deserves ammunition. I'm not going to say how to use that ammunition, because that might be considered in some way some sort of call to arms or violence or whatever by YouTube. And I don't specifically want to get this channel shut down. The only shooting up I talk about is jokes. But goddamn, like, if this doesn't make you want a gun at the very least, nothing should.
Well, at the very least for me, it just makes me despair to some extent, because it is being fought against. The idea of even an investigation is being fought against by every major media network, which then makes me ask, why? Why are you guys fighting this? This should be basically gold dust to any journalist. Hot, proper scandals involving really powerful people. This is dirt gold mine. Why aren't the rags in the States going all, like, why haven't they been going crazy for like 18 months?
Well, I mean, the reason for that is obvious, and, you know,
yes.
I hate to say I fucking told you so, but the goddamn truth is I motherfucking told you so, not you, the royal you again, about the fucking idea that Trump is in charge of a goddamn reality show, and the whole thing is designed to be a distraction by the fucking elites. Sorry, Q-tards, you're wrong.
Now, I'd agree with you were it not for the fact they've done a fair bit of wrangling of pedophiles in a year and a half. More than they've done in like a decade in a year and a half. It's been quite, if you look for it again, the press don't really record it. You have to look in local newspapers to find a lot of this shit.
Yeah, but here, the press don't record it, and the majority of the globe doesn't cover it either. The only people being indicted here are the people who are being thrown under the bus. I fucking guarantee it.
At the moment, I would agree wholeheartedly. I'm not entirely. I haven't. For me, the jury's still out as to whose shit is going to actually hit the fan in the end. I'd like to think that some big names will finally begin to roll soon, but I'm under no. That's a hope. I'm under no delusions that hope is probably largely unfounded, but we'll see. I mean, I'd like to believe Q's real to some extent in what he's saying is happening.
I wouldn't.
But I don't believe that Trump is like the grand poobah, uber savior, God Emperor Ubermensch that people like to portray him as, and Q in particular. I have noticed the Jesus Christ returns sort of motif that seems to be associated with it, and I think you're taking it too far, mate.
I hope he's not real. I mean, I hope he's not genuine. And the reason I hope he's not genuine is because if he is, people are going to look to one person as a savior, and they're going to look to this guy as a good guy in government, and nobody's going to change, and shit's going to get worse. One person cannot save the world, ever.
I agree.
It's gonna take a globe of people who want no rulers to avoid this sort of power consolidation and corruption inbreeding as soon as possible. Like, that's the only way to make this change, and if it doesn't, we're all gonna fucking die.
True. I just do find it to be a very intriguing phenomenon. I find that it's quite useful as a data mining tool, and I just find it very interesting that once it really starts making some serious or getting some serious headway, all of the mainstream media went lockstep and created 60 articles in a day on why QAnon is bogus nonsense. And I found it very intriguing. It's like, this is exactly what they did with Syria. This is exactly what they did with Iraq. This is exactly what they do whenever they try to say something is a lie that isn't a lie. And I just find it coincidental.
But here's the thing. They also post against Trump regularly. So if that's the case, I guess Trump is a good guy too, because that's a cargo cult mentality.
Well, I'm not saying necessarily that both are 100% interlinked. I personally consider both phenomenon to be, at least in some degree, independent.
Yeah, but what we're talking
about, that one is tied to the other.
But what we're talking about here is anything that the press says is bad is probably good, and I disagree with that because the enemy of my enemy is not also necessarily my friend.
I agree with you on that, but my caveat to that is I'm saying that when the press all goes. Every member of the press basically goes lockstep and says, no, this is false, look away, don't pay any attention to this.
Oh, yeah. I watched it with Gamergate.
Yeah, same thing they did with Gamergate. It's exactly the same sort of principle it's the same tactics, and people need to start looking at those tactics. Because it's those that actually, for me, determine whether or not I really ought to be paying attention to this news source in future.
Right. And just to get to some of these comments, because we're nearing the end of the hour, and I don't want to go over the hour like we've been doing the past fucking 40 times.
That's fair enough.
Fucking Finian says the reason they get away with this child trafficking, murder, etc. is because they're above the law, like the Lolita Express, Clinton Foundation taking kids from Haiti, the Podesta brothers, list goes on and on. Agreed. Daniel says what goes up must come down, though, and I'm thinking that we may be watching a slow fall. Maybe. I don't know, though, and I'm a cynical asshole, so, I mean, pleasure to meet you. Fucking Finian says the enemy of your enemy may be your ally, though, and I'd love to stop the pedos, whether that gets rid of government or not. Well, I don't think you're going to get rid of pedos unless you get rid of government. That's my point. And I do understand the ally thing, though. Otherwise, I wouldn't be trying to form anarcho-coalitionism. But at the same time, fucking, you got to know who's a valuable ally and who's not. You can have an ally who fucks everything up.
Yeah, you could. Your allies could be. Think of it Game of Thrones style. You could have a good ally, or you could have Walder Frey.
I don't know that reference, so.
Well, okay. Anybody who watches Game of Thrones will probably get it. Red Wedding. That's all about that reference. Probably you've heard of.
I've heard of it. I won't say I know what it is, though.
Fair enough.
Maybe just describe that for like 30 seconds.
All right. So, spoiler alert for anybody who watches, who hasn't watched it yet, from 4 years ago. Walder Frey basically is a huge traitor. And if you really want to know why, read the books or watch the show.
Very cool. All right, well, and I do mean to watch or read that at some point, and I've been told to read it over watch it because like pretty much every libertarian I know, with very few exceptions, watches and/or reads it. Shout out to Mance, by the way.
I'd argue you should read it because and watch it, because watching it means you'll actually be further in the story than has actually been written. But reading it, at least you get a very good view of how governments can work. Not for people, except basically the leader, but how they actually work, how the politics work in a system where pretty much anything can go. Politically speaking, at least. It's very feudal. And that kind of exposure, it does help people to understand the pitfalls of any kind of centralized systems.
Well, I mean, of course, it doesn't necessarily provide a broader solution base, but, you know.
Yes,
and then
Patient Zero. Yes, you're right. They do have a Federal Reserve in GOT. It's called the Iron Bank.
Yeah, I was going to actually address some of Patient's comments as well. And he's been saying, makes me wonder if Britain's treatment of tea caused him to be more, quote, quiet, exactly the way they wanted him to be, quote, more quiet. I honestly think at this point he should flee the country. Pizzagate was hijacked against the emails, and toward one pizza shop, another hijacking. Yeah, agreed.
Narrative control. There is a very powerful way that anybody can cover a story up, and that's not by actually hiding it. It's by basically twisting the narrative just enough to make it seem like it's some sort of ridiculous nonsense about one location and nothing else. Now, that one location, as far as I'm concerned, deserves investigation. But again, it's not one of those things where you can't just rely on people's word anymore. You've got to look into these things. And if everybody's saying, no, we can't look into these things because reasons, there's no way of actually finding out, is it true or false? So you can't just presume it must be false, because nobody's proved it one way or the other. And as evidence grows, as accusations grow, the preponderance of evidence will eventually fall onto the other side of the equation. And I think that's going to happen fairly soon if people like Fiona Bartlett and whoever Nicole Kidman's dad abused as well. I'm trying to remember the woman's name, but I can't. Some Australian chick basically came out a couple of years ago with her story, and then like the next day, Kidman's dad died in another country after fleeing Australia.
Right. Wow.
It was all very interesting timings again, and that's another important thing to pay attention to is timelines.
So just last comments before we wrap. Danielle says, I'm a skeptical optimist. Well, I'm a skeptical cynic, which means that I'm skeptical to the point of, like, not taking anyone seriously when they say they have good intentions. I don't even trust the people I fucking live with, so. But, and Finian says, I do believe government without pedos is possible. Maybe, but that doesn't mean that the government won't be a power center for pedos to come in. And that's my point. I think the fact that power is concentrated and monopolized means that when you have the justice mechanism being reinforced by that, it encourages these sorts of people to join so that they can have a protection for their corruption. So that's my thing. Like, and Finian also says the whole thing with Trump is that he's supposed on a mission to restore the law. No fan of his, just saying what I've heard, supposedly, that is.
Yeah, and if it is simply that, it gets us back to a framework that we can then reasonably negotiate from on our side. Because at the moment, the framework is, here's what we've written down, ignore that, because we have our own rules that we're not going to tell you, and you're just going to have to deal with it, because if you complain, we'll kill you or put you in prison. And it won't be a prison that you actually know about. It will be someplace in Chicago that's a black site.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that that's a good thing to remember as well, because there are so many examples of ways that the government can essentially silence you and disappear you. And it's good to remember that the general vibe of anyone involved in truth should be to remember that the system is not on your side. No matter how much it might look like it is, it's going to protect its own much more readily because it has to. So remember that, and yeah, I think bad morning to everybody out there. Smash the state, fuck the system.
Bad morning, everybody.